Hi guys. Today I had the pleasure of sitting down with Glenn Van Zutphen, the CEO of Vanmedia Grou and the host of Money FM. It was an absolute privilege. We sat down, we talked about his life in journalism, living and working across Asia and the US, and it was a real interesting chat. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Cheers. Glenn, good afternoon.
Paul, great to be with you.
Thanks for making the effort, man.
Oh, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You've had a busy weekend, right?
It has been a crazy weekend.
Tell us about your activities on a Saturday and Sunday morning to begin with.
Well, here we sit at the end of a very long weekend for myself. But every Saturday I have my radio show on Money FM. So typically up at around 6 or 7 a.m. in the studio by 8. And then we're live from 9 to 12. So 3 solid hours of interviews and talking and banter and all that kind of stuff. And then in the afternoon, I typically have to start working on hosting the podcasts for each of the interviews we do. So that's 5 or 6 interviews a Saturday.
That's full on.
And that's full on. But yesterday was a special day because in the evening, I was asked to MC the 89th annual George Washington Ball that's hosted by the American Association of Singapore.
Wow.
So it's almost 400 people at the Ritz last night, including heads of ambassadors and things like that. So that's always a duty that I enjoy. I've done it many times in past years, but it takes a lot out of me.
You've got to be on point, right?
Yeah.
And then if you started early,
Yeah.
you know the funny thing is anyone that goes into the restaurant business, they forget because they romanticize it. But like with you, your Friday nights are kind of gone because you've got to be up at the crack of dawn on Saturday.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, look, just for those that may not know you, can you be kind enough just to introduce yourself, a little bit of a backstory before we roll back the clock?
Sure. I've been a career journalist for 25, almost 30 years now. And I started in the U.S. I'm from Chicago, went to school in Los Angeles, graduated from University of Southern California Journalism School. And
were you a Chicago Bulls fan or an L.A. Lakers fan?
Oh, definitely Bulls.
Good man.
Yeah, especially that was the 80s. That was the mid-late 80s when I was living there, so had to be a Bulls fan. But came to Asia first about 35 years ago. So I first after working in journalism in the U.S. for a few years after university, I got the Japan bug. And in those days, in the late 80s, the talk your viewers may or may not remember was about the Pacific Rim. Japan was buying America. Japan was really on top economically and in terms of producing cars and electronics, of course, the Walkman and all the different things, from days gone by. And so living in LA, I had some experience with a Japanese advertising agency as an intern during my university days. And I thought, you know what? I'm out of school. I want to go to Japan. So packed everything up, went to Tokyo, no money, no job, no place to stay.
How old were you?
I was about 22, I think, at that point.
Isn't it great? It's so exciting.
Yeah.
And then tell us what happened.
First of all, I got very hungry very fast.
Did you end up loving noodles because you had to, I guess?
Well, back at that time, there was no internet. So I had the Lonely Planet guide. I had the Japan Lonely Planet guide, which had the name of a couple of youth hostels in it. So I landed and just went and showed up at this youth hostel way outside of town. And anyway, long story short, I ended up living in Tokyo and working for 6 years.
Amazing.
Loved it, had a great experience, worked as a journalist there, and got connected with different folks. And so that was kind of the beginning of my international experience, kind of long ago and far away at this point.
I fell in love with Japan because I read James Clavell's Shogun years ago. And then I read all of his series. And then I don't even remember, he made a miniseries years ago. Well, not him, but and with, what's the name of that actor?
Richard Chamberlain.
Oh, yeah. Good-looking guy, and I actually prefer that a lot more than the more recent one that came out.
The new one that came out on Netflix.
Yeah, I just, it was so authentic. And I don't know if you've read the backstory, but they created those sets and they really struggled because most of the cast didn't speak Japanese, in English, sorry. And then a lot of it is actually in Japanese and there's no subtitles, but somehow you get it.
Yeah.
And then I remember watching one of my favorite movies, Black Rain with Michael Douglas. And I thought, I can't wait to go to Japan. This was when I was younger.
Classic late 80s movie, what's going on in Japan, what's going on with Japan. So, one of the interesting things, when I was working there, I got a job first working with NHK, the public broadcaster there. And they needed, American voices to to write and read the news, both on radio and they had a TV service that was an English language service. So I spent a lot of time in what they call the NHK Broadcasting Center, right in the middle of Tokyo in Shibuya. And one of the coolest things about that, well, a couple cool things. First of all, they have a capsule hotel inside of NHK because so many people do such long hours.
Yeah.
And I had to stay there a few times when I was working late and starting early the next day. But the other thing is when you go to the cafeteria, and it was like you see in maybe some of these Hollywood movies when they go to the cafeteria on a set, and people from all different types of productions are in there. So you had people in there in Shogun costumes, you had people in there with teeny bopper costumes, and so just to walk in and have lunch in the NHK
What a ride.
lunchroom was just amazing, right? It was like watching history, hundreds of years of history, just based on the costumes that people were wearing.
Well, tell me, because you were saying off camera you had a bit of acting experience or back in your LA days.
So when I was in LA, when I was in school in LA, I needed to make some money. So I did several things for part-time work. One was I became an extra. So I am a card-carrying member of the Screen Extras Guild, not the Screen Actors Guild. All right, which was okay because Screen Extras still made, at that time, quite a good thing, was about $300, $400 a day.
Back then?
For an extra.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that's good money now.
It was not bad, yeah. I was in Pizza Hut commercials and all kinds of different things. And then I had an agent who was a bit of a slippery guy, but he said, hey, would you like to go to an open casting call for a new movie that's coming out? So I said, sure, right? So it was Halloween, I'll never forget this, Halloween 1984, October 31st. And I went with several of my friends from school. I went down to the Paramount studio lot, and there were like 3,000 young guys that looked exactly like us in the queue, right? And we went in, they took a picture of us, we had to make a funny face or something, and then and they asked us 2 or 3 questions, and then it was like a conveyor belt, Turns out that was for Back to the Future.
No way.
So the part that Michael J. Fox eventually got.
Yeah.
They had already started shooting, and they had to replace the actor that was in Marty McFly's role.
You mean he wasn't the original cast?
He was not. No.
I didn't know that.
And it just wasn't. The original actor just wasn't working out. For them. And Michael J. Fox was doing a very popular TV show called Family Ties at the time.
Yeah.
So he was really hot. He was a hot actor, but he was busy. So you see a lot of the scenes in Back to the Future are filmed at night. It's because he was working during the day on Family Ties, and he would shoot Back to the Future at night.
Really?
Yeah, many of the scenes are.
That's crazy.
But that was my one lost opportunity. Having seen Michael J. Fox over the decades, I'm glad he got the role. I mean, he was Marty McFly.
Oh man, he's
all day
amazing.
long.
But he was. I remember Teen Wolf, Secret of My Success. He was fantastic.
All of those.
Actually, it's funny when you look back, because I told you off screen, I love movies. Top Gun with Tom Cruise. Originally, he wasn't meant to have that whole relationship with Kelly McGillis.
Right.
They added it afterwards because they felt that the movie needed something.
Yeah.
So that whole famous love scene, he was already working on something else, and he came in.
The magic of Hollywood.
Yeah. So like they went to a hotel, filmed this scene overnight. Dimmed it out black and white, kind of like you said earlier. It was brilliant. So then in Japan, what unfolded after that?
Yeah, Japan was. So let me give you a broad statement, which is the more you say yes in life, the better your life is going to be. Yeah. Assuming you don't make really bad yes choices, right? Which we certainly have had friends, and maybe we've made a few bad ones ourselves. But saying yes was, I think, really key in my life to doing what I consider to be interesting things. So not only was I working for NHK, but then NHK had a relationship with ABC News, American ABC News, not the Aussie one. And they needed a radio correspondent in Japan. So they saw I was doing work, and I had a journalism degree, and I was a warm body in Tokyo, and they said, will you do this? And I said, sure. So I started doing that for them. And then,
but you're too. You should have said I'm too handsome to do radio, right?
Yeah, face for radio, right? And then a woman came through town at a conference, and she was the international editor for USA Today newspaper. She's like, hey, we need a Far East correspondent. Would you do that? I'm like, sure, why not?
Wow.
And so I just kept expanding and kept doing a lot of things, and it burned me out, quite honestly. After 6 years there, 5.5 years, I was burnt, but I had some amazing experiences. Traveled the country.
Yeah.
And really got to know. I learned Japanese to be fluent in Japanese. And
Do you still use it? Not so much.
Not so much conversational, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's been 30 years. I've lost a lot of it, but I really, really enjoyed my time there, and never met so many kind people, Japanese people who were kind to me, showed me kindness.
Amazing.
Over the years that I was there, that are still friends today.
Beautiful. You know, actually, I was just thinking about this. Unless you've lived in Asia, in major cities like Tokyo, Singapore, Hong Kong, you won't realize that you and I, let's just say you and I went out for a couple of nights in Hong Kong together.
Right.
We would invariably, between us, meet a bunch of people that are connected. And if you didn't, you could become connected and build out a network just within a couple of nights.
Right.
If that's your mindset. And I think that's what you probably meant. You were probably out and about and enjoying yourselves, networking.
Yeah. Yeah. And the in terms of a career progression, so many of the people that I met in Japan that were working at NHK, they had a lot of divisions doing, all kinds of different news in English and things. And the other journalists I met there became friends of mine for decades, and including one dear friend, Mei Lee, who is now back in Los Angeles. But she and I eventually worked at CNN International together. Then we worked at CNBC Asia here in Singapore. She actually helped to get me my job here when I was leaving CNN and coming to Singapore 20 years ago. So you just never know where these connections are going to lead you. And again, there's probably 10 or 15 friends that I had from the late 80s, early 90s that are still my friends.
Very dear too.
Circling around the region, doing really interesting things. And of course, now they're at the top of their game.
Well, when you meet people on your way up, no one, you don't need anything from each other. You're in the boat together, so to speak. Yeah. Actually, another movie that I've just remembered, Robert Mitchum with Sidney Pollack, which is directing, was called The Yakuza. I don't even remember that one. I don't remember. It's not a particularly well-known one, but I love that movie.
Yeah.
So then you've worked with all the C's. So it was ABC, CNBC.
Yep, CNN International.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I've written and contributed to a whole slew of different publications.
But did you, if you go back to your university days, what were you studying? Did you know you wanted to go into journalism?
So when I first started in college, I started at a small liberal arts school just outside of Chicago. I was there for 2 years, and it just was not my vibe. It was too small, so I left and went to USC. But I had always thought in my first 2 years I was going to be a lawyer. I wanted to be pre-law.
Okay.
And I famously tell the story to my kids, I don't know, some kind of an object lesson, that my freshman year I failed Latin, which is not a good start if you're going to be a lawyer. You kind of have to get through Latin at some point. And then when I realized it wasn't all just like the TV shows and the way that, lawyers are perceived on TV shows, you actually have to kind of do some work.
Yeah.
I decided, maybe I better look at something else. And I got involved in journalism, and I had always done kind of communication type stuff and had jobs in radio stations and things when I was in school. And so I knew that was something that was probably a good fit for me.
I mean, you've interviewed, close to 3,000 people, maybe even more.
Yeah,
right?
We're over 3,000 now.
That's amazing. Yeah. It really, truly is. What are some of the more memorable people that you remember interviewing?
I'll tell you, I think the most interesting for me, most consequential, happened in December, I'll never forget, December 13th, 2001. And that was during the War on Terror.
Yeah.
Of course, September 11th, 2000 was the big, terror attack in the U.S. But December 2001 was when the coalition forces liberated Kabul and kicked the Taliban out of Kabul, Afghanistan. And Hamid Karzai, who eventually became the president of Afghanistan, rode in kind of triumphantly to reclaim the city of Kabul. And I was the first one to interview him.
Wow.
I was actually at CNN Center in Atlanta, but we got him on the phone, and he had literally just rolled in on U.S. Jeeps or something like that were coming in with the troops as the Taliban fled, and we did the first interview with him. And the reason it was so interesting to me was just because there was so much hope for what the future of Afghanistan would look like without the Taliban.
Yeah.
Because, prior to the Taliban, Afghanistan was an amazing country. It was very forward, very progressive, much like Iran.
People forget that. When you look at old pictures.
Yeah. It was...
And how the ladies were dressed, very glamorous.
Exactly.
Quite westernized in some ways.
Westernized, educated, a lot of great things were happening, and the Taliban obviously changed all that. So there was a great deal of hope for what Afghanistan would look like, which of course, 20 plus years later, it didn't work out. The U.S. pulled out, as they would have had to eventually, but the local forces weren't strong enough to keep the Taliban back. So now basically they've kind of gone back to, reverted to where they were before they were kicked out. So it's just sad.
Did you look up to any journalists or broadcasters growing up that you decided to shape your own career on or interview style? I'm just curious.
None. I respected a lot of journalists, Walter Cronkite and some of the classics of American journalism. There were never any that I said, I need to be like him, or I want to affect that style of conversation or questioning. It was just more, what I always was interested in was how were they presenting this information in a way that was going to be interesting and relevant to me. And this will be a theme that you and I will talk a lot about today in this podcast. Yeah. Because that is something that's super important. So I can't say that there was one specific person that I thought was great. I've seen and worked with a lot of people that their public persona is these amazing journalists and wouldn't you like to be like them? And having worked with them behind the scenes, I know what incredibly miserable people they are, miserable humans they are. Really? And, they might be good at their job, but once you get on the other side of the microphone or the camera,
forget about it.
You don't want to have anything to do with these guys. Interesting. Which is a bit kind of sad.
It is very sad. Yeah. You know what I've realized, because I thought about this, because most of us end up in jobs that we didn't necessarily dream about when we were younger. Right. So for example, if you grew up playing sports, you'd have favorite sports players. Yeah. And then like if you were playing, basketball, if I was playing football, right. You'd pretend you were those players. But, you'd probably, because you weren't thinking of being a journalist, so by the time you reach that age, you're already a fully grown man, right? So it's a little bit different. So then you moved to Hong Kong, right? After Atlanta. Was it the other way around?
After Tokyo, okay. I went to Switzerland for a year.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
I worked in Switzerland for a year.
So you're in Geneva?
It was just outside of Bern, called Fribourg. And that was more of a...
Glenn, you've had a hell of a life, man.
That was kind of a year off after being kind of burned out working in Japan. And then after that, I went to Hong Kong, which was right before the handover. Yeah. So I was there from 94 to 98.
So you saw the handover. Wow.
Oh, yeah. I covered it, which was was an amazing story as well, obviously.
Yeah, huge.
And living there in the run-up to the handover was quite...
Did you ever meet Chris Patton? Or...
Yeah.
You did?
Yeah.
I like the way you say, like, for the rest of us.
I shouldn't be so nonchalant about it.
No.
Yes, it was really interesting to meet him. He was really trying to do the right thing. Yeah. With the
he seems so genuine in all the interviews I saw him in.
And Beijing just was not having it. I mean, the things they called him, son of 10,000 you-know-whats, and like they were not kind to him at all.
Yeah, and I think I remember his daughter was getting a bit of a hard time in the press, which was really unfortunate. Yeah. They were young at the time.
It wasn't pleasant. Yeah. But I think, having been there from 94 and seeing the way the British actually adjudicated justice and everything within Hong Kong. Yeah. They had an independent commission against corruption. The police force was one of the world's best police force, mostly staffed with Hong Kong Chinese folks. And so they had the institutions that were just really, really rock solid. And a lot of that has sort of been altered in ways that I think are not necessarily positive since then. Yeah. Yeah. But, it's Chinese territory now, so they can do what they want with it.
That must have been some of the most memorable news that you've covered, right? I mean, what would the top few be in the course of your career?
Yeah, that was a good one. That was a really good one.
Because that was global.
That was absolutely global. The war on terror, obviously, September 11th and all that was just...
Were you where? And
I was in Atlanta.
You were
on September 11th.
Oh, you were.
Yeah,
because we all remember where we were when we heard the news, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's and when you watch movies now, you go back and you see the Twin Towers, and it was like crazy.
When it was before.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just so iconic. I was watching Harry Met Sally.
Yeah, the other day.
Last week, 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
and they have a shot of that.
I have a shot. I watched that. Is it less than a week ago?
Right? Is that right?
Like, yeah,
I remember watching at the same time.
Yeah,
but whenever you see those shots, it does kind of like it does. It's a little bit of a heart twister for you. But yeah, those were really, really good stories. Across across the years, though, the decades, there have been so many, like, different financial crises that have come along, covered those in Japan, any number of earthquakes.
Yeah.
One of the most shockingly memorable, sadly memorable, was the 2004 tsunami. So I had just arrived in Singapore in November to start my job at CNBC.
This was the first time you moved here?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, when I first moved here. And, a month later was the tsunami. So we sent teams all over, obviously, to Aceh and different places. And I went, my team went to southern Sri Lanka. And so we covered it from there, which was, it was the most surreal thing because, right on the coast, it was absolute devastation.
Yeah.
You had these massive ships that were picked up and lifted and put onto the shore. And in the case of Sri Lanka, there was a train line that was running along the coast right at the time of the tsunami. Like 1,500 people were killed. And it's just like mine. But then you got like 200 or 300 meters in.
Yeah.
And there was nothing.
Well,
Everything was normal.
topography of Sri Lanka, you go from the coastline of Hikkaduwa, and then you're up in Kandy. They probably, if there was no TV, they wouldn't even be aware of it.
It was, yeah. And the waves only went so far everywhere, and so you would have utter devastation right on the coast. And then just, less than a kilometer in, it was fine, like absolutely fine.
Yeah.
So it was really
crazy. Knowing Sri Lanka, I haven't been back for a long time. I've been there a couple of times, but I spent 10 days on my own doing a solo trip.
Yeah.
And I had a chauffeur driver for part of the journey. We didn't speak any English. And we were behind a bus that had maybe 30 or 40 people hanging out of the side of the bus on the top of the bus. And unfortunately, the bus collapsed and went over.
Oh.
And he said, "Oh, shit." So I was thinking, he does speak English.
Oh.
And he just drove on. And I said, "Should we go back and help?" And he just kept driving. And a few people must have died. And I remember thinking, wow, the infrastructure's not here. Yeah. And it was when you see that. But what a beautiful country.
Amazing country.
So what brought you to Singapore? Like the job, but had you been physically to check it out, or you literally moved here when you got the phone call?
Yeah. I had been coming to Singapore since the early 90s.
Okay.
Because
we always seen all the iterations of Singapore.
Well, exactly, right?
Yeah.
When we were, being based in Japan at that time, you had to do visa runs. Every 3 months, you had to get out and go someplace. So I had, been here. In those days, went to Koh Samui, in the early 90s when the roads were literally still sand. And same with Boracay and places like that, right, in the early 90s. So Singapore was one of the places I came. And in fact, I stayed at the Pan Pacific Hotel, it's in Suntec. And we were
when you first came here, you mean?
When I first came, yeah. And we were on one side, we were on the north side of the building, the hotel room. And it was so noisy because they were building Suntec City.
Yeah, I remember.
It was just a big pit.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's because all that reclaimed land hadn't been developed yet.
Correct.
Because I stayed in Marina Mandarin, when I was 11, and we've got pictures, and it's just breathtaking when you see what wasn't there vis-a-vis now.
It's amazing.
It's bonkers, isn't it?
It was amazing.
And then if you explain to people in countries like in Africa or in the US, the concept of reclaimed land, they look at you like, "What? That's bonkers. Doesn't make any sense." Yeah. It's mad, isn't it?
It really is. It's quite amazing. So coming here. So to answer your question, I've been here many times over the years, but 2004 was the first time I came here to live.
And what's kept you here for so long?
Yeah, 20 years later. Let me tell you, my wife and I, we originally didn't know how long we were going to be here, and then it's you're here, you're working, you start having kids, you realize this is a darn good place to have kids.
Yeah.
Grow up.
It's safe.
Yeah. It's manageable. You can have help, which I could never afford if I was living in the U.S., to be honest with you.
Well, it's a foreign concept by and large. Like where I grew up, if I told my friends back home, I've got a live-in helper, it would be foreign to them. Because where I grew up, if you've got a dishwasher, mate, you've done well. You've hit the jackpot. Good on you.
Yeah, none of us grew up with. I mean, we didn't grow up with help. We learned how to wash the dishes and vacuum the living room and all that stuff, right? So we just decided, over the years, it was a good place to be. It was always fascinating to see. So, as you can tell, my time in Tokyo and Hong Kong and Singapore, I love Asia. I think Asia has been and will continue to be the story It has certainly been for the last 30, 40 years, and will continue to be going forward, just based on the economic factors and the growth and the population shifts and things. So I think it was just an awesome place to be. And for that stage in our life with kids and then getting married, we got married here as well, that it was...
Where did you get married? In Singapore?
We did
was it the RO? You had the ROM here and the ceremony, or?
Yeah. So we did the ROM, our solemnization, at the top of Mount Faber, where the cable car goes up.
Yeah.
So right up there was the solemnization. And then we did, a month later, we did our family wedding at the Shangri-La in Sentosa.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, the Rasa Sentosa.
Yeah.
So
we had our ROM in our house, not this house. We owned a lovely little house down the road. And the thing is, it was just meant to be my wife and I, her grandmother, her mum, because her dad had passed away. And then I turned up downstairs and there were like 40 chairs being laid out.
Wow.
And I was actually really upset because I thought I had no one to invite. And, but I couldn't begrudge Tara having all of it, because we were having the ceremony a few weeks later in Bali.
Oh.
But it was a weird feeling because I was getting married. And when we had done everything and signed everything, because of the time difference, I couldn't even call my mum and dad. So actually the day itself was quite lonely.
Right.
It was a weird feeling, but when you're away from home, everything's different.
Yeah.
Well,
we decided we would get married, do the family service in Singapore, realizing that it might be the only time our family would come and visit us.
Yeah.
Right. And as a destination wedding. So we planned it that way. We planned it around a U.S. holiday so that people had extra time during that week and just did some things like that.
Well, when people make that effort, they really want to be there.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know what I mean? It's meaningful to them.
Yeah. And we had about 60 people, I think, show up, which was great,
So what were some of the key takeaways from being an anchor? Because I'm just so curious about what you've learned and how that's segmented and, dovetailed into your career for the last 20 years.
Doing the work always pays dividends. So when I was an anchor and a producer and writing and reporting and doing that all through my career, it was a constant grind of doing that work.
Yeah.
Right? And like any job that anybody has that's listening or watching this podcast, if you do something enough for enough years, you should be getting pretty good at it.
Yeah.
Right. And so the experience that I had, especially CNN, which was 24/7, weekends, nights, days, whenever, to go in and be on air for 6 to 8 hours straight, and it could, breaking news and this and that, and there's a fire here and there's a hijacking there and there's a this and that, and you're constantly having to really, really think about the stories, be a quick study on getting on the computer and seeing what's going on, and then being able to ask questions quickly, and most importantly, probably listen to the people that you're actually talking to. And then, because you pick up a lot from what they're saying, and all of a sudden, list of questions becomes meaningless when they say one small thing.
It takes you down a different rabbit hole, right?
Which was the right rabbit hole in the first place.
Yeah.
Right. That you didn't even know existed.
But haven't you noticed a lot of people, when they're doing interviews in any capacity, they're so busy thinking what they're going to say next, they're not listening to the person they're talking with.
Right.
And then, the conversation is not fluid.
Yeah. It's a challenge. And anytime, as the interviewer, I'm against sending out lists of questions to my interviewees. I give them topics.
Okay.
Say, hey, we're going to talk about your company. We're going to talk about your results. We're going to talk about your new product, whatever. And I put it on them to be able to know enough about their product, their industry, whatever it is, to be able to answer any question I can ask them.
Well, you can ask them open-ended questions and let them run with it, right?
Yeah, we ask them. I mean, they could be. I like to ask open-ended questions. It's a little more interesting.
Yeah.
Every now and then there's a closed-end one in there, but that's okay too. But so that's as the interviewer. As the interviewee, I need to be ready to understand what the interview is about. You and I discussed, over WhatsApp what this interview would be about, so I can kind of get my head in the right place for it.
Yeah.
Now, you kindly gave me some questions, which we've broadly, but not specifically, been sticking to.
Yeah, they're loose, right?
They're very loose. They're more topics, right? Which is fine because it just gets my head in the right place. So I, in thinking about doing this interview, there are certain things that I want to recall, my LA stories or my whatever. I might not have thought about them for a long time.
Yeah.
Right? But it's okay to remember those and then use them in the course of the interview. So that's on me as the interviewee.
Yeah.
And this is what we find in my coaching business, that a lot of,
Tell us about your coaching business. Give a quick intro to what you cover.
So Vanmedia Group is my company. We started 18 years ago only doing media training for folks. That was right after I left CNBC. They laid off 14 of us, sent our jobs back to the U.S. And so my wife and I had just been here a couple of years, and we decided we wanted to stay. So I started doing media training. But then that, over the last 15 years or so, has broadened out much more to communication skills training, public speaking, podcasts, TED Talks, conference, keynote speeches, etc. And depending on what a client needs, we kind of help them through that whole, whatever that looks like, whatever their need is.
But I want to touch on this because the way that you glossed over it, for a lot of people that are thinking about the entrepreneurial route, is quite daunting. Was your transition quite easy? Because all of a sudden you go from doing the job to having to sell the job to bring the business in.
Yeah.
And that's a different challenge, right?
Yeah. Oh, I knew what I knew, and this is, a lot of journalists become media trainers. Like this is one of the common steps. They go into PR, or they become media trainers, or they do different things. And what I found over 18 years was, as I think back to that first couple of years, I hope none of my former clients are listening, but I didn't know what the heck I was doing as a coach, right?
Yeah.
As a coach and a trainer.
Yeah.
Now I knew how the media worked, so I could do that stuff. That no problem with that. But I feel like the value add for my clients now is the experience I've had of doing this for 18 years, and thousands of coachees. And because everybody is very different in the way they need to be approached.
For sure.
It's not a one size fits all. And every communication opportunity is not a one size fits all.
What I find fascinating is, because when you're working with clients, how do you work with those that are very shy and nervous about public speaking?
Right. The most important lesson that any coach, I think, can give to a coachee, especially in the communication space, is I am not trying to make somebody into a communicator like me.
Yeah.
I have no interest, no ability, no desire, and I think it's a bad idea to say, hey, after our sessions together, you're going to be just like me. And
it's terrible.
It never works.
Yeah.
It's done. So what we do instead is we take them through what the best practice is for being impactful in their communication. What does that look like? What does telling your story look like? What do key messages look like? What does, repetition, the physical, the eye contact or body movement or whatever, what does that stuff all look like?
Yeah.
And then let's take who that person is, quiet, shy, and retiring, or loud and boisterous, or anything in between, and let's help them be the best, most impactful communicator they can be. I don't know if you saw, when Donald Trump was inaugurated, he went and he did this church service at the Episcopalian Church in Washington, D.C. And the minister, the reverend, she gave a very, very calm, quiet homily, sermon to him, and then at the end implored him to be merciful and just. And it was the most quiet, calm moment of delivery of information, and it set Trump and the administration and the media on fire.
Yeah.
Because here she was, she wasn't shouting, she wasn't doing anything that we are used to in our political landscape these days. Very calmly, very quietly, but just nailed the words, nailed the concepts.
Fantastic.
That was, wow. I mean, it was shockingly powerful.
Yeah.
So that's one example.
But I find if you do meet people like that are very peaceful, it could be a minister, it could be a massage therapist. There are certain people that lower your blood pressure, and those people are rare and special. One of the challenges I'm sure I have this, because I'm naturally an introvert, although no one would believe that, is, so for example, I've got a dinner tomorrow night, and it's a surprise birthday party, and the lady organizing said, listen, don't be afraid to go out there and make sure that the party's rocking, and I don't know anyone that's going to be there apart from the birthday boy. And, it's like sometimes that to me is overwhelming, because they expect you to be on all the time. Do you find that you get that? Because you must have, because you're the host, you're the keynote speaker. How do you reason with that?
I like to think that my public persona is not all that different than who I am in person. I don't, we see this a lot actually in Singapore radio, which bothers me a great deal, which is apparently whatever the broadcasting school is that everybody goes to here says, you have got to be, hey, great time. Let's go to Singapore. It's Saturday morning. Let's do the show. This kind of 1980s, parody of an American DJ, right? And everybody seems to feel like they've got to have that. And that's why, personally, for me, when I listen to radio in Singapore, I get a headache more often than not.
And a lot of people, radio here.
Exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
I can't listen to radio here because it all sounds the same.
Yeah.
And it's something about the training process, and I haven't been involved in that training process, so I don't know exactly what it is. So to your point, when people see me, I hope that I'm the same. Now, when I'm on stage last night, in front of 400 people, I'm seeing a thing. I have to speak up a little bit more forcefully.
Yeah.
I have to be thinking more, obviously, about my audience, but pausing a little bit more, maybe slowing the pace of my speech down, because I'm in a room with 400 people. There's echo, there's bounce, there's people don't hear and understand you.
Yeah.
If you don't slow your pace down in situations like. So I do some of those things, but basically I don't have the Glenn MC persona.
Yeah. You're not tremendously different.
I think people can spot fake. They can spot fake very quickly.
Talk to me a little bit about best interview tips.
Yeah. From the interviewer or interviewee?
Both.
See, notice how I ask a question to make sure?
No, I would say it's a great question. I would say firstly as an interviewer, because that's what you do and I'm trying to do it. So I'm learning from you.
Yeah. Obvious. There's the obvious ones, right? Know who the subject is, know basically something about them, and why are you interviewing them in the first place?
Yeah.
When we interview people on the Saturday morning radio show on Money FM, we, by we, I mean myself and Neil Humphreys, my co-host, we look for people that are interesting to us.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. The second thing is everybody that comes on the show, we give them one mandate, and that is you need to be able to say something interesting or useful to our audience. Something they're going to care about, not just what the interviewee cares about, right?
Yeah.
Pushing a new product, a new service, a new whatever. And so when you get to that, as the interviewer, I look for people that can give something interesting. I also really, really spend a lot of time listening during our interviews. And that's why I scrap lists of questions. I mean, sometimes we get some talking points, or like I said, we give topics or whatever, but I have done this enough that when I ask somebody, I can automatically see the flow of the conversation.
Yeah.
If you and I are talking about executive search, I can see very easily how the flow of that conversation goes from, what are your basic offerings all the way to what are you finding is most useful for people looking for new jobs or organizations looking for new employees. There's different branches that you can take that.
Yes.
But I like you've been around long enough that I can understand a little bit about how that world works, and then dig in on you to get you to tell me more about it.
But I think therein lies a great skill. Like being an investigative journalist, you are predetermining which way, as you said, the branches go. But I think a lot of people get stuck.
Yeah.
What about if someone has been interviewed?
Yeah, being interviewed. Expect the unexpected. Yeah.
Be ready to rock and roll, right? You have to be at all times.
Yeah. I'm coming to talk with you today. We've discussed some areas that we'll discuss today, and that's great. But you could literally ask me anything, and I would have to think of something to say.
Yeah.
Now, to be truthful, it's not really that hard for me to do that anymore because I've done it a lot.
Yeah.
But for most people, they're not ready for that. So, where are the things that are maybe that you didn't really think about? Or if you're an executive, are there skeletons in your corporate closet?
Yeah.
Are there things that if your private secretary had a partner who was a journalist and told that person those secrets, what would those secrets be? And then you as the interviewee, how would you answer them?
Yeah.
And be ready to answer them.
Yeah.
Right? Because you just never know in this world how information gets out. And so that, be ready.
Especially nowadays.
Yeah.
One of the things I always tell people is, so for example, when we're interviewing candidates or we're helping candidates when they're going for job interviews, the reality is typically you'll have a lot of people that have a very similar skill set. So what makes the difference is one's personality, your engagement. The client's got to want to work with you. And obviously you have to have the ability to deliver. So I always say that's something that is always missing, that ability to engage on a personal, social level, inviting somebody for a coffee. These things go amiss big time.
I was coaching a friend's son 2 weeks ago, and
How old was he?
He's 24.
Okay.
24. So he's going for his second job in the U.S. Right, and he's going for a job at a communications firm in Texas. And so we were chatting about it, and he's super smart, and he knew the company, he'd done his research. And I said, have you connected with all of them on LinkedIn? Have you looked at all of their LinkedIn profiles, the 4 people that are going to be interviewing you, basically the top 4 people in the company?
Yeah.
Have you really dug in on that?
I love it.
Have you Googled them? Have you seen, do they have have they done any public speaking that you can look at their YouTube video or posted anything? You dig out nuggets like that as an interviewee if you're being interviewed for a job, for example.
Yeah.
That's the kind of stuff that sets you apart. It's that one reference. Hey, I saw you did that conference, in New York City, and you mentioned this about your company. I was quite intrigued. Automatically, the person that's the interviewer is like, wow, this person took some time.
Yeah.
So doing a little bit of research.
I'll tell you a funny story. I placed a global CFO, and he had a series of interviews, and he had a final round of interview. And I asked him, have you printed off and read the last 2 years annual reports like I asked you to? He said, no. I said, what are you doing? Your interview's at 1 o'clock. And I said, look, I was pretty pissed off with him. I said, you've got to take the morning off, come to my office, I'll print them off, let it in my briefcase. And I said, highlight some points, and whatever happens during the course of that interview, open the briefcase, take it out and let them know, come back with 2 or 3 selling points.
Last year you did. Yeah.
Right. Just that engagement. And what surprised me was he hadn't done it. He's still in the job today, by the way, if you're listening.
Oh, good for him.
Talk about common interview mistakes, though. Things that people typically will go wrong, where they'll go wrong.
First and foremost, from the interviewee, they are thinking about pushing information. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of folks on the radio show every week that have some sort of new thing that they're doing, whether it's an event or, like I say, a product, a service, something like that. And the interviews that are the least interesting are the ones where they literally come in and sound like a press release.
Yeah.
Like, our company's doing this, we're pushing this is what we're doing. The best interviews are the ones where they come in and say, hey, our clients are expecting this from us, and this is what we've developed to give them X, Y, or Z, right?
Yeah.
And so as an interviewee, not pushing information, but giving an audience and letting the audience draw information from that person that they think will be useful.
Yeah.
That's a mind shift for a lot of people, a lot of public speakers, executives. They don't quite understand that at first, but spending a little time working with them, they finally get it. And it changes the complexion of interviews, press conferences, whatever.
Even though I've been interviewing people for 30 years, when we started doing the podcast, one of my best friends, Neil Bullock, and he was the first one that we released afterwards, he said, you interrupted me too often because we're best buddies. So it's like we were having a beer and it's banter. And he showed me, or we listened to a few clips of another podcast that he listens to. And after that, I've said to a lot of the people, look, when I ask you a question, don't be put off, but I probably will just let you talk. Because sometimes if someone's not used to it, you obviously, black belt, second dan in doing this, but people get nervous when are you going to ask me something else? Do you know what I mean? So there's the flow. So it depends on the medium. Anyway, so that one of the biggest challenges I've always found is how do you apply your science in a different way and reinvent yourself, which is not easy. So if you've got a very seasoned CEO and they're used to talking, but now they're public speaking, they're presenting in a different way, how do you unpack that? Because I'm sure a lot of them are stuck in the mud, like they're so used to operating in their mannerisms.
Yeah. 2 things I usually start a coaching session with early in the session. One, I ask them what their biggest communication challenge is, right? And they'll say, oh, I'm not comfortable. Oh, I don't know where to look. Oh, they'll give you any number of reasons. And I'll say, okay, that's good. I appreciate those things. I think what your biggest challenge is going to be is you know too much. Every executive everywhere that is in a C-suite or a high-level managerial position, they have to know everything about their company. And what happens when people know a lot? They say a lot. they speak a lot, they overspeak, they tell too much to a given audience. What happens when we talk too much and ramble on? From the audience's perspective, people get bored, they get lost, they get tired of listening, they get confused. Everything's bad about it, what can happen, right?
Yeah.
So this is the first thing, how we can help them to understand how they need to edit that 100% of information that they have about their company down to 10 or 15% that's necessary for a given audience.
Yeah.
Now, occasionally, you're doing an M&A or something, you're going to need a lot more, you're going to need a deeper dive on everything the company does. I'm not talking about those circumstances. I'm talking about the average, engagement at a conference, for example, or being on a podcast or talking to the media. You only need 10 or 15% of the knowledge that you own about your world.
Yeah.
To be interesting.
That's a very good point.
The second thing I say to them is, everybody I work with is a pretty good talker. They've reached a level in their career where they've done presentations for many years. They've probably done keynotes and any number of town hall meetings, etc. But this day and age, it's not good enough just to be a good talker. You have to be a strategic communicator. Why do I say that? And I'll say that again. You can't just be a good talker. You have to be a strategic communicator. I use the analogy of Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo. Those of you that, you yourself, I'm sure you've been there. It's where 5 big major streets come together right outside of Shibuya Station. The Hachiko dog statue is there. Everybody knows it. And it's this crazy, 3,000 people can cross the intersection when it's time for people to walk. It is the most amazing spot. When you go at ground level, and I show a picture of this during my coaching sessions, and you see all the neon signs that are around, especially at night, it's unreal, right? Everybody takes that picture when you go down to Shibuya. But within that picture, whenever you take it, whatever point in history or time you take it, there are going to be certain things, certain signs that stand out to you. Maybe it's a Monster logo, for a Monster drink. Maybe it's Shibuya 101, the department store there. Maybe it's, who knows what it is, right? Tokyo Hands or something. Or there could be a whole bunch of other, there would be a whole bunch of other neon signs that just don't really resonate. They don't stand out. They have a company's name, but you don't recognize it, those sorts of things. This is like, the analogy is, this is the media landscape. This is the communication landscape that we are all in right now and have been for quite some time. You think about your social feeds, not only what you're consuming every day, but what you're also pushing out.
Yeah.
And most of us are pushing out posts on whatever, we're receiving posts on whatever. We've got multiple platforms that we're on, social media, not to mention the internal company, you're on your company Slack or your company WhatsApp, the group or whatever. So there's all that coming in, and emails, and it's mind-boggling how much stuff comes in. All right, why do I bring this up? Because this is the environment that executives or comms people or marketing people are communicating in. So how do they stand out? How do they become an impactful communicator? How do they become the Monster logo, that green and black M that you are going to recognize? It's like a kind of a pretty typical marketing and branding thing, right?
Yeah.
You see a Coca-Cola sign, you see this, you see whatever it is that resonates with you. This is what we need to get communicators thinking about. How do you do that in a verbal way when you are presenting information? Once they crack that, interesting things happen. First of all, they become a really great communicator. Secondly, a lot of their nervousness goes away because they know how to communicate and they know what to communicate.
Yeah, that's a very salient point. Yeah.
And most importantly, they know when to stop communicating, right? Go this far and then stop. Right?
Yeah.
Don't go this far, kind of a thing. It's an amazing process. It's a beautiful process to see happen.
Do you find, though, the evolution of communication has changed so much because everything has become short format?
Yeah, like any time in history, you've got to be ready to evolve with communication. I mean, you see the value of TikTok, for example, short form videos, or you see the value of a good LinkedIn post or something like this. And this is where I'm getting a little bit annoyed with LinkedIn because it's looking more like Facebook.
Yeah.
To me, over the past 2 years.
Yeah.
People posting their stuff about their kids and their birthdays. And I'm happy that people have good family lives and have birthdays and all that, but I don't care.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Oh, something's flying around me. On LinkedIn, I don't want to see that.
Yeah. It's business.
I want to see business stuff.
Yeah.
Right. and even the business posts. I don't know if it's people are using ChatGPT to generate them, but they're getting so long.
Yeah.
400, 500, 600 words long. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Give me 200 words. Give me 300 words.
Concise and punchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Give me what I need to know, and then let's move on, because I don't have all day to read your post, your individual post. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's all about, understanding the times that we're in. What are the vehicles that you need for the audiences you want to reach?
Yeah.
And then, being able to adapt to it.
So talking about evolution, how did Money FM come about? And tell me more about it, because when we first started talking, I didn't know you were involved, and I find that fascinating.
Fire my marketing person.
And that was that simple.
Very good friend of mine. For 25 years now, more than 25 years, Jason Dacey was a sports broadcaster here in Singapore. He and I first met each other at CNN International. We started literally the same week in 1998 or so, and when we were working at CNN. And he was here in Singapore for nearly 20 years. He had this show on Money FM. It was at a Saturday and Sunday morning show. He would have me on occasionally. He had a segment, which we still have today, called the International News Review, and we talk about geopolitics. And so he would have me on occasionally to be a commentator on that. And then he would occasionally take time off on holiday or whatever, and he needed somebody to sub for him. And this is going back, like I say, about 7 years. And so he would have me fill in for him, because I had done radio throughout my career, knew how to do it, basically. I was an easy substitution. So then 4 or 5 years ago, he decided to move back to Australia with his family after decades overseas. And he asked me if I wanted to take over the show, and I said, yeah.
Why is it on Saturday and Sunday?
So it's not on Sunday anymore.
Okay.
It was on Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 12. And then I just got to the point where, without a producer, I was having to produce the show myself.
What does that mean for people that don't know?
That means finding guests. That means wrangling guests. That means everything, even on the one morning, running the board, all the levels on everything.
Yeah.
We do it all.
Then you can't get a budget to do that.
Politely, no, I couldn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was no money for it.
Yeah. So that's what, but I do love that about you, is you roll your sleeves up. You've got to get stuck in, right?
Yeah. The thing is, I love doing it. I love doing the show, and my co-host Neil and I have a great time together. He's an amazing storyteller.
I've read before I didn't even know he was your co-host until you mentioned it today. Yeah. But I've read some of his stuff.
Yeah.
He's a comedian, right?
He's a sports journalist, originally a sports journalist.
Oh, I didn't know that.
For decades. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. I mean, football and many pretty much any other sport. But he's written 35 books.
Yeah.
Most of them on Singapore.
Yeah.
And so he's been here 25 years, so he knows what's going on. So we have a great time. But we had to figure out the guests, and every Saturday and or Sunday we were doing at least 5 guests.
That's full
each day. So that's 10 guests a weekend.
Yeah.
Without a producer to help do that. Now, those of your listeners, viewers on this podcast who've never had to get guests for anything wouldn't know this, but it's not just a matter of one email or one phone call and everything's settled.
Yeah, enlighten the audience what's involved, because it's a pain.
It's a pain.
Yeah.
It's 10, 20 emails.
Marcoms.
And then you got to, if they have a corporate minder, a gatekeeper, you got to go through them.
Yeah.
And it's all this back and forth. Even us, we tried to do this a couple weeks ago and we had to cancel it.
Yeah.
So even we had to reschedule it, through no fault of our own, but just circumstances. And that's what happens, right? So if you have to do all of that pre-production work.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And then you're actually doing the work itself. It was a lot.
It's time consuming.
It was a lot. So I a couple of years ago, I said to my boss, I said, look, I'm happy to go back doing both days, only if I have a producer. If I don't have a producer, and if I'm doing it, and Neil's helping me, then we're just going to do one day.
And it's live.
It is live, yeah. Yeah.
Could you record and send it out post-production, or does it have the same meaning? I'm just curious.
I guess it would be possible.
So, because then I'm just so
but people,
curious.
I think on a Saturday morning, people want to hear live radio.
Yeah, they want to hear the banter and the chit chat. Because I grew up with I don't even remember Rocky 1. He's in the morning, he's cracking the eggs. But if you actually go back to that scene, he's listening to the radio, and some fella's doing a prank call. He's calling up a woman.
Oh,
yeah, and she's like, "Why you called me at 5 o'clock in the morning?" And I grew up in London, so it depends on who. If you were driving to school with your parents, you'd listen to Classic FM or whatever, I'm into rap and dance music, so it'd be a little bit different. But then if you wanted to listen to the news, you'd listen to BBC.
Yeah.
So you have your tunes, your radio programmed. But then the other thing is, it must be challenging because you're bringing the audience members in. They arriving late and early, and you're circling them in and out. That can't be easy either.
Yeah, it's it's the nature of radio. And one thing we have found is because we're streamed across several different platforms, we have quite a healthy following in Australia. We have a healthy following throughout Southeast Asia.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Even into North America, West Coast and East Coast, because we have a lot of I have a lot of friends in government and that world. So we and friends and listeners in the UK, although it's a little more challenging for them because of the time difference. But we do have some that stay up late.
What are the typical sorts of guests that you have on the show?
We oh my gosh,
and it varies, right? But
we vary. We had the head of hepatology, snakes. The head snake guy for Mandai Nature Reserve on last week, talking about the year of the snake and telling us more about snakes, right?
Wow, I've got a lion doctor coming onto the show via Zoom.
Okay, so yeah,
because after I went to Kenya, I was very excited about it. Okay,
there you go. So we might talk about that. We've often had Ben Horton on, who's the head of the climate at NTU. They have there's a climate group here that's studying climate change and stuff. So we have him on talking about climate change. Steve Oken comes on every week for our international news review, talk about geopolitics, things that are happening that impact this region.
It's very broad.
Yeah, we had the guy last weekend. He's the president, Ang Yuit. He's the president of the Association of Small Medium Enterprises in Singapore.
Oh, wow.
ASME, it's called. And that's a huge organization for businesses.
Yeah.
Next week, we're having a young actress on. She's doing a one-person show. Having her on, a Singaporean gal. We do a lot with the arts, do a lot with culture, a lot with...
Has she already done her show?
It's next week.
Okay.
This coming.
No. Has she acted in the one performance?
No, it's coming.
That's because I do you remember A Bronx Tale?
Yeah.
So I saw Chaz do an in-house live version of that, and it blew me away because he transported you there. He was playing all the different roles, and I don't even know the story. He wrote that because he couldn't get cast in anything.
Yeah.
And then De Niro bought the rights and agreed to doing it. And actually, I wanted to try my hand at acting. And one of my guests on the show, he said, look, I'll give you a couple of scripts. And I read them. But the thing is, I said, look, I'm only going to do it once. And I don't want to be typecast.
Right.
And they were dodgy characters.
Right.
And I said, people are going to remember me for all the wrong reasons. But that would be a real challenge to get up. If she's doing like an hour and a half on stage on her own,
by herself,
that's mind-boggling.
And all through, over the years, we've had quite a wide variety of people, not only from the arts and entertainment, but from sports. One of I think the most interesting interviews we had over the years was a young lady called Danelle Tan, and she's a footballer, a professional footballer. She's 18 years old. She was playing as a 17, 18-year-old for Dortmund.
Okay.
For their ladies team.
Wow.
And she just got a contract in Australia. And so now she's playing professional football in Australia as well. But this young lady, Singaporean gal, so sharp, so erudite, such a great communicator. Her folks have always supported her choices to live overseas and to practice football and become a professional player.
Yeah.
Which is quite unusual in Singapore, right?
So unusual.
Very unusual.
Well, and also, if you think about the student athletes in the US, they are media trained from day one.
Yeah.
Right? And, that is probably obviously missing here.
Exactly.
Because there aren't many professional athletes.
Yeah. Or even you look at Joseph Schooling.
Yeah.
I mean, his parents literally sold their house.
I know.
So that he could go, $1 million+ in education and fees for him, so he could go to Texas and swim in Texas and learn.
I really think that Joseph is not adorned enough. He's not revered enough in Singapore. I
totally agree with you.
I just think what he accomplished, because he didn't just win. He won in an Olympic record. He beat everyone was there. It's not like, there were some races where not everyone's there.
The big boys.
He beat the big boys. Really is amazing. Quick rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So if you could only communicate through one medium for the rest of your life, what would it be?
You had mentioned, can I say social media?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll say social media.
Yeah.
Just because it's so broad.
Yeah.
I love, obviously radio, TV, but I think social media is going to be the future.
It is, right?
Yeah.
It's just everything's changed now. The game has changed. When you sit down with people, if they said to you, Glenn, I've got 24 hours before I've got to get on stage, and then I've got to go straight in, on a TED talk, and I've got to go and present to a small board, what would you teach them in that 24 hours if you literally had one day?
Yeah, I had this happen actually with a guy just this past week. He just bought a football team in Poland.
Really?
And he was,
wow.
And he was going on, a wonderful guy, and he was doing his press conference.
Okay.
He was literally bought it on, like Wednesday, and Friday was the press conference in the town. In
crazy.
Poland. Sorry?
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. So we literally went through this whole thing, and we did it virtually because he was overseas. He was in Europe at the time. So first things first, right? What do you think you need to say to this audience, right? What are the expectations? Second thing is, who is in the audience? Third thing, what does the audience need to know or want to know, do you think? How much do they already know about you?
Yeah.
And third point on that, what are their pain points or their sensitivities?
Yeah.
Right? Could be cultural, could be economic, could be a lot of different things. But as a speaker, if we can get those things in our mind first as we're thinking about our presentation, I think that's the way you start.
I love it. What would you say was the most valuable lesson that you've learned in your career as a budding journalist coming up through the ranks?
Multitasking for sure. But
well, you still do it today with the production.
Which I still do today, but I will be honest with you, I'm leaning now toward leaning away from a multitasking lifestyle.
Okay.
'Cause I'm finding it's not sustainable. And like I grew up being a general news journalist, I love doing every kind of story, from sports to politics to business to whatever. But my advice to a young journalist now would be focus on one thing. Be amazing at one.
Give a specific example.
Yeah, be a business journalist.
Okay.
And really dig in and know everything about business. And business is a pretty broad topic, obviously.
It is. Well, even if, look at like Jim Gray, right? I met Jim Gray once and he was so interesting. But if you look at the body of his work, it's very diverse. And if you're passionate about that subject, it's great. But the reality is, like business, it is so diverse.
Yeah.
It really, truly is.
Yeah.
So go deep.
I think so.
Yeah.
Assuming you've got good mentors in that particular field that you're studying, because that's important, right? To have people you can look up to and ask questions to. But go deep.
If you could sit down and interview any three people, past or present, right, famous people, I'm just curious.
All right. One would certainly be Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
So
I like that.
U.S. politics.
Yeah.
I gotta go there. Who I find is super interesting but highly underrated in modern culture is a singer, a guitar player, Bonnie Raitt.
Don't know. Okay.
She is amazing.
Okay.
She's just an amazing person, American. And third, my third, I think it would have to be, well, I've actually given him questions before, Lee Kuan Yew, but I would like to really sit down and talk with him more in depth. He's one of the hardest, it has shown over time, he's one of the hardest people to interview.
I've seen some interviews with him and he's really on a different level.
He's really sharp.
Well, Tara's sister's coming for dinner after this, a half-sister, and her grandfather was Eddie Barker, and he was the Minister of Law for Singapore. So he was Lee Kuan Yew's right-hand man, and his wife's still alive today. And some really interesting stories back then. Yeah. And talking about the Japanese, and she grew up in a time during the Second World War where, the impression of Japanese was very different, very scary, of course, right? And the crazy thing is, it's not that long ago when you really truly think about it. But it's so interesting. Yeah. We've both got kids. I'm just curious because one thing I've learned about kids is they don't listen to their parents, not directly, maybe a little bit through osmosis. But if you were to sit down and talk to your kids, they're 18 or 15 now. What advice are you giving them on their journey, through to college, university, work? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's so funny. My mom, we just marked the 7th anniversary of my dad's passing. Okay. And the 3rd anniversary of my mom's passing. Right? Okay. So I thought, this idea of generational memories has been
makes you think, right?
Has made me think a lot in recent months, and I find myself sounding like my dad more and more. I think as parents get older, they sound like their parents more. And I hope that the things that I'm saying to our kids, Kate and Max, are the good things that they're going to remember. And typically we tell them things like, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Say yes to everything. Say yes to experiences that aren't dangerous, but say yes to things. Get to know people. Your friends today in their school today will be, at least a few of them will be friends for life.
Hopefully, yeah.
And they will be doing really interesting things, because as third culture kids growing up in an environment like Singapore, they're meeting other third culture kids and Singaporeans as well. And these kids are going to be really interesting someday. They're going to be leaders. And even if they're not leaders, they're going to be doing interesting things.
For sure. Well, look, Singapore's been kind to both of us, right? We've been here.
Indeed.
I moved here in 2001.
Yeah.
The one thing I loved, we moved to the US because my wife, she's a Fulbright scholar. She got into Yale to do a PhD.
Brains of the outfit.
Yeah, 100%. But she married me, right?
Marry up, buddy. Marry up.
But the funny thing is, when we met, we really, what I love about great marriages or any friendships or partnerships, where we hadn't accomplished anything when we first met. Yeah. I had no money. She was still studying. But when I look back at my time in the US, unequivocally, it was my favorite time, partially because of the children's ages, and I was able to drive them to school, collect them from school. I was working Asian hours.
Nice.
But the thing that I learned about the US, and maybe you can speak on this, was growing up in the UK, if you were, for example, very good at sports, which I was, if you were a little bit audacious and, let's say, confident, like to celebrate and what, people would tear you down. So if you look at David Beckham, when he was at his height, the media brought him down and wanted to keep him down. And what I loved about the US largely was, if you saw someone that was successful, people would look at that person and say, wow, that person's doing really well. I can do it. This is how I'm going to do it. And that I mean, maybe it was but I've traveled and lived in different parts of the US, but that just is so refreshing. Yeah. It's that mentality about winning and trying your best, and not being afraid to do so. But, you've lived and worked around the world even more than I have. Yeah. Isn't it so interesting how different cultures impact how you do business, for example?
The culture I find the most dynamic in Asia is Vietnam, Vietnamese.
Well, look at their history and how they bounced back from everything.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And the first time I went to Vietnam was 1997. So that wasn't very long after the U.S. had normalized relations with it. And I was nervous. I was living in Hong Kong at the time. I went with two of my Canadian friends, and we did planes, trains, and automobiles from Saigon all the way up to Hanoi, right?
Love it.
Over 2 weeks. And I was really nervous as to how I would be viewed
and received.
And received.
Right? Yeah.
They couldn't have cared less.
Yeah.
All they cared about was working hard. And they were working, 12, 15 hours a day, hustling, making a better life for their family, their kids, getting a better place to live, getting a motor scooter, getting a TV, whatever it was that they, obviously getting the kids educated.
Yeah.
And I still see that hustle today. And no society is perfect, but I really, really,
it's refreshing.
am drawn to the Vietnamese work ethic and what I've seen over the years.
I did, maybe 2 years ago, I did a 10-day bike trip, and I don't have a motorbike license. So it was a bit scary. I did the reverse. I started off in Hanoi, and you see the number of vehicles on the road. It's like, am I really going to do this?
Right.
But there were a couple of times where I had trouble with the bike, and it broke down, and people just would help you.
Yeah.
Right. And they weren't asking for anything. And of course, you would give them something. But then when I went to some of the old army camps where you saw how they hunkered down and built those, underground fortresses, it's mind-blowing.
It's mind-blowing.
Really.
Yeah. So I really, I like that. Different Asian cultures offer different things.
Yeah.
And there's no one that's, I think, the best. But the Vietnamese, to me, are just really, are special.
Yeah.
And they faced, we call it the Vietnam War. It's the American War, right?
Yeah.
Versus the French War, versus the Chinese War, versus the, go back however far you want.
Yeah.
How many times they've gone to war.
Horrific, really.
Is really crazy, right?
Yeah.
And, the Americans just happen to be kind of the most recent ones.
Well, Glenn, it's been an absolute pleasure. I will leave a link if anyone wants to reach out and contact you.
Great.
And I'm looking forward to sharing a meal with you now.
Paul, it's been a pleasure. Thanks to you, and thanks to all your listeners and viewers.
Yeah, good man. Thank you. Cheers.
Yep.